So I'm going to begin with the first divergence, the one from 1500 to about 1800. It starts with the voyages of discovery of Columbus and Vasco da Gama and ends with the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And we see in this period countries like Britain pulling ahead of other countries in the world. So these income differences I see as the consequences of the first globalization. And in this globalization that starts with the Americas and the voyages to India and China, the English and the Dutch in the end of the day are the big winners. They established commercial empires that transformed their domestic economies. They generated rapid urbanization. There were large rural manufacturing industries that sold products internationally. Agriculture declined and became more productive, and there were energy revolutions as well. And these are the bases for the industrialization of these countries at the end of the period. So an example of the kind of changes is in Whitney, which is a little village about 10 miles from Oxford. The Hudson Bay Company bought all its blankets there. They were made in cottages in Whitney and the surrounding villages. This is a picture of the blanket hall where the weavers brought their blankets to be sold to the Hudson Bay Company, and they wove them in little cottages like this. These are the kind of 3.5-point blankets that they wove in Whitney, and you can see this poster on the right for Early's original Whitney Point blankets. They were made there since 1669, and you can see them being swapped with a native for beavers in Canada. And the ramifications of this for Britain were that there were a lot of jobs that were created in these kind of export industries in spinning and weaving. And it's the culmination of all of this activity that has a big impact on the economy. And one of the consequences is that it creates a particular kind of economy in Britain in which there are very high wages compared to other countries, and as it happens, very low energy prices. And it's these prices that lead to the invention of industrial technology. So this graph shows you the history of real wages over time and across space for some European cities. This is only a selection. This is from a research program I've been doing for 30 years, collecting the data to do this. But in thinking about this, this shows the ratio of full year's earnings of a building laborer to the cost of maintaining a family at bare bones subsistence. So if this equals 1, the laborer's income equals that cost of subsistence. That's like the World Bank poverty line. So today, people say that living standards are more or less the same across Europe, and you can ask yourself, when in the past, if ever, was that true? And the answer is in the 15th century. That's when the differences were smaller. And after that, there's been a great divergence. There are flat real wages at a 4 times subsistence in the big maritime cities of the Netherlands and England that were pushed forward with a commercial activity. Everywhere else in Europe, Central and Southern Europe, and for that matter in India and China, real wages collapse under the impact of population growth and end up at bare bones subsistence there at the end of the 18th century. So this difference between a rich Northwest Europe and a poor rest of the world is not the consequence of the Industrial Revolution. It happens before the Industrial Revolution. And my view is it's the cause of the Industrial Revolution. That the Industrial Revolution is invented to offset the high wages of Northwestern Europe. One of the impacts of it, though, turns out to be on literacy and knowledge among the population. These are estimates of literacy rates in 1500 and 1800 for different European countries. 1500, they're low everywhere. 1800, they're higher everywhere, but they're highest by far in the parts of Europe that are transformed by the the international global commercial revolution. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is that because these societies are urbanized and commercial, there's a big demand for knowledge, for skills of literacy and numeracy. And also because wages are high, parents can afford to educate their children because they're paying for it basically themselves. So there's a kind of positive feedback that's going to emerge between prosperity for people and the subsequent economic growth of their economies. Another way in which wages are high in Britain is relative to the cost of capital. And I've worked this out in various ways, but in the 17th century, there isn't any difference between labor relative to the price of capital in different parts of Europe. But by the end of the 18th century, labor is much more expensive relative to capital in Britain than it is on the continent. And that gives businesses the incentive to use more capital-intensive technologies and underpins the inventions of machinery in the Industrial Revolution. India, the first time I can measure this for India is in the 1820s. The ratio of the wage to capital cost is even lower, so there's less incentive than to mechanize in Asia, even than in Italy. And finally, the growth of London led to the development of the English coal industry, and that produced the cheapest energy in the world in northern England. The price of coal in Newcastle is at the bottom here. Beijing, it's much more expensive. Paris, it's much more expensive. And so this cheap energy is another thing which fosters the Industrial Revolution by providing cheap fuel for all sorts of activities. So the inventions of the Industrial Revolution I see as the creative responses to these factor prices. The inventions are biased technical changes that use more capital and energy to increase the productivity of labor. They're profitable to use where labor is expensive and energy and capital are cheap, and that's Britain, and that's why the Industrial Revolution is in Britain. So here's some examples of this. So some products are made all across Asia, Eurasia, in the 18th century, and one of them is silk. And these are pictures of silk mills in England. And that's the first silk mill. It's a big building. Here's a diagram of it. The power source is a water wheel. That's really expensive to build. There's a lot of capital involved in producing power and making silk there in England. This is a picture of a painting of a silk mill in Japan in the 19th century. Japan's a low-wage place. It's the other end of Eurasia. So how do they use a lot of capital to power their silk mill or not? Well, the answer is not. This is the power source of the silk mill. This is a guy turning a crank. It's hard to have a more labor-intensive power source than that. So what we see is that technology responds to the different prices that businesses face. And in Europe, in England, they go for capital-intensive technologies and invent them, pushing progress forward, whereas the incentives are the reverse in Asia. Another example with coal and energy, porcelain is an industry, a product that's made all across Europe and Asia, but they don't make it the same way. One of the stages in making pottery is firing the pots, and this is the kind of kiln that they use in England. It's like a Bronze Age kiln. There's no change for thousands of years. They burn coal on the bottom, the heat goes up, they've got pots and a chamber above it, and then the heat just goes out a flue on the top. So they lose most of the energy, it just goes up the chimney, right? But energy's cheap in England with cheap coal. In China, what do? In China, they invent an incredibly complex and intricate technology, the point of which is to get all of the energy into the pots rather than having it go up the chimney. They have a fire and they have pots in here in one chamber. It fills with heat. It doesn't go out the top. It's forced down into another chamber like that, gradually up here. And at the very end, there's a flue that draws it out. So this takes a lot of capital, but saves on energy. So this is the kind of technology. It's not that the Chinese don't invent technologies. They invent technologies that are appropriate to their circumstances, but their circumstances are different. So you get a different process of historical development. So my basic idea about the way the first industrial revolution happens and the initial divergence takes place, it starts with aggressive, this is the politics, aggressive mercantilism and empire formation, which by the British in particular, which leads to an export boom for England and rapid urbanization, which generates wages that are high by world standards and energy that's cheap. And that leads to people to invent technology, take advantage of that. Technology that uses a lot of capital and energy to raise the productivity of labor, like the steam engine. So we get the Industrial Revolution. All right, so that's my, so we're 20 minutes into it and we've done the first globalization. Now we just have to get from 1820 to the present day, right? So since 1820, the income differences have exploded. So why has that happened? I want to say that divergent development was due to the interplay between technology, globalization, and economic policy. Okay? So this is a graph that makes the point that I made earlier, that the countries that were richest in 1820 grew the most, We have income per head in 1820 for different regions and growth factors from 1820 to 2008. So in 1820, if your income was like $400 a head, that's like Africa, you get a growth factor of about 5, and you end up in 2008 with an income of $2,000 per person. Whereas if you were up here like England and your income was $1,200, you have a growth factor of 25, so you end up with an income per head of $30,000. So the gap has got much, much bigger. And there's a few exceptions, these interesting East Asian exceptions like Taiwan and South Korea and Japan. What's going on there? Now, one of the things that's been an important feature of this divergent development are differential processes of industrialization and deindustrialization. And this graph, I'm sure we could spend a long time looking at it. We're not going to. But the important thing is we look in 1750. This shows us the percentage of the world's manufactures that takes place in different regions. The biggest region in 1750 is the big white bar here. That's China. China is the biggest manufacturing economy in the world in 1750. The next biggest one is this set of bars here. That's the Indian subcontinent, right? China and India are the biggest manufacturing centers of the world. England is up here. You can't even tell. It's just a little tiny bar there. The Americas aren't anywhere in here. What happens as you go up to 1900 is that the Chinese share and the Indian share collapses. And at the same time, the English share, the British share gets really big, and then it's overtaken by Western Europe and North America, whose shares get larger. Now, these aren't just not a question here of it's not like the Chinese keep the same volume of manufacturing output and the British produce more. It's actual declines in India and China as well. Those economies are deindustrialized in this period. At the same time, the economies of Western Europe, Britain, and North America are assuming their economic hegemony, their preeminence in manufacturing. Since then, there's been some changes. You can see here, China is beginning in 2006 has become quite large, and I understand that in the right now, Chinese manufacturing is as large as American manufacturing. So I have to revise this graph, and the world will have come full circle with China being the biggest manufacturer here and the biggest at the end. So but we're not on that graph. So why did this happen? So I'm going to talk about technology, about globalization, and about policy. So technology, the way I see it, the West became rich by inventing labor-saving technology that raised labor productivity often through more capital and mechanization. Ultimately, this, and I don't go, the processes by which this happened are interesting. I don't want to go through those, but eventually some of the increase in output per worker was realized as higher wages, and then the higher wages in turn led firms to invent even more capital-intensive technology. So you had a kind of increasing cycle of prosperity. This was accompanied by high and growing levels of education that aided pure and applied research. And another feature is over time, Western technology became not only more capital intensive, but also larger scale. Efficient factories got bigger and bigger. And an important point is that much of this technology is not cost effective in poor countries. It doesn't pay to spend a lot of money on expensive machinery if labor's really, to save labor if labor is really cheap. We want to see that. So today I think there's a world production function that represents the technological options of all countries. And these are graphs that outline that function. Those of you who've seen economics books will see that this looks like a production function with output per worker here and capital per worker here. More capital per worker leads to more output per worker, but the curve gets flatter and flatter because of diminishing returns. So this looks like these points bracket a kind of textbook function as they do. And these data points show data for blue triangles are 1965 and red dots are 1990. The technology's changed, but in a particular way. All the improvements, all the changes in technology consist of inventing more points up here that have more capital per worker and more output per worker. If you go down below $30,000 per worker, absolutely nothing's happened. The 1990 points are just the same, smeared over the 1965 points without any change. All the action consists of the countries that were rich here in 1965 inventing technologies that moved them up here. And that's the change, and nothing happens anywhere else. So I thought that's really interesting because that's my story of the Industrial Revolution, which I said it consists of inventing machines that have more capital per worker and get more output per worker. Textile machinery does that. All sorts of machinery does that. So what happens what happens between the Industrial Revolution and that graph I just showed you? Well, to find out, I extended the 1965 data back to the 18th century for as many countries as I could by splicing them onto national studies of the capital stock and the output and so forth. And when you do that, it's the same story all the way back. All the action is at any point in time, the most productive, richest countries invent a technology that moves them up and to the right on those kinds of graphs, and nothing happens anywhere else. And the other feature is that these new technologies don't pay in the poorer countries because they only pay where wages are high. It's all done in response to the high wages that produce the conditions for wages to become even higher. So I can show you this. I'm not going to show you. What I want to show it to you is by generating the history of the world from 1800 onward, at least for 3 countries, and then comparing it to the world today. So we're going to look at the histories of Germany, the USA, and the UK. And this point here is the UK in 1800. It gets like $4,000 of output from a few $1,000s of capital per worker. So it starts there. You go to 1840, it's like that. 1880, it's up there. 1913, it's up like that. And then you get up here till today, and they moved up there, and they're getting almost $30,000 per worker with $20,000 of capital. So what happens with the U.S.? Well, it starts off here just below the UK, it moves up like that. And it's below the UK until the USA overtakes the UK. But it's the same kind of thing. They keep inventing a technology with more capital per worker, more output per worker. They get up there, they're really moving ahead. We're up here to the Second World War, and they get up there till today with more output per worker and more capital per worker than the UK. Now Germany, it starts off even lower, goes up like that, kind of keeping pace with the US. Here it gets more output per worker, but look, they're getting lots of capital here. And one of the things about Germany is they're famous for these investment banks. Well, they do generate a lot of capital, but their output per worker isn't quite as high. So they get up here like this, and they end up very rich with $30,000 of output per worker, but much more capital per worker than it took the other countries. So there's some intrinsic inefficiencies in the German economy, I think. But anyway, so if you look at these graphs, it kind of looks like all those dots and triangles, right? It kind of starts down here, and it goes up here, and it kind of is flattening out. More capital per worker is more output per worker, and there's a flattening out process. And in fact, it's not just that these graphs look like this. It's like they completely overlap exactly the cross-section that you saw. So when the pattern the historical paths of development by which rich countries got rich are exactly the same as the technological options the world faces today. And that's because the technologies always invented by the rich countries are the only ones that do much R&D, and they do it as they move forward. And they operate with some capital labor ratio for a while. They invent a technology with more capital and labor, higher capital labor ratio. They improve it a bit. Then they move on to another higher one, leaving the old ones behind, and nobody does anything with them. They just kind of stay there as options, and poor countries are on them.